Hey there, ready for a deep dive? Today we're looking at how different horse breeds experience pain. Like, is there really a difference between a stoic Frisian and, say, a quarter horse?
Right. And it's interesting because the study we're diving into today, it goes beyond just, watching their reactions. They actually got down to measuring what was happening inside the horses'
Oh,
bodies.
wow, so using some fancy tech to see beyond just a flinch or a change in expression.
Exactly. They were measuring something called parasympathetic tone activity, PTA for short, along with heart rate and using a grimace scale.
Okay, so multiple ways to really understand what's happening when these horses experience a pain stimulus. So what kind of horses are we talking about?
They focused on three breeds in this study: Frisians, quarter horses, and warm bloods.
And was the choice of those specific breeds significant?
Definitely. You know how there's this idea that Frisians are kind of stoic, less expressive when they're in pain? Well, this study really wanted to put that to the test. They wanted to see if there was actual scientific evidence behind that observation.
Okay, so using the quarter horses and warm bloods, breeds known to maybe wear their emotions on their sleeves a bit more as a point of comparison.
Exactly. It's all about comparing those reactions to see if there are measurable physiological differences in how they experience pain.
So take us through this study. How do you even begin to measure these internal responses in a horse?
So they started by establishing a baseline for each horse over a couple of days. They'd take measurements of their PTA, their heart rate, and their grimace scores at three different points throughout the day. But crucially, this was all done when the horses were just resting comfortably.
Right, so you know what's normal for that horse before you even think about introducing any kind of pain stimulus.
Exactly. You've got to have that control group, right? And what's fascinating is that even in these baseline measurements, they started noticing something interesting with the Frisians.
Oh, what was that?
While all the horses had pretty similar PTA levels overall in this resting state, the Frisians consistently showed a slightly higher baseline PTA compared to the other two breeds.
Hmm. So even when they were just relaxing, chilling out, their parasympathetic nervous system was a bit more active. For our listeners who might not be as familiar with that term, can you break down what PTA actually means and why it's relevant here?
Absolutely. So, PTA, it reflects how active your parasympathetic nervous system is, which is the system that controls all those rest and digest functions. Think of it as the opposite of that fight or flight response, which is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. When we're stressed or in pain, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and usually our parasympathetic activity goes down.
So if these Frisians are showing a higher resting PTA, does that mean they're just naturally more relaxed, less reactive to stress, even at baseline?
That's one way to interpret it, yeah. It could be a piece of the puzzle as to why Frisians have this reputation for being stoic. Like their internal state is already predisposed towards calmness. Maybe they just don't jump into that stress response quite as quickly. And that's what makes the next part so interesting. On day 4, they're taking all those baseline measurements and they're moving on to actually testing how these horses respond to a pain stimulus.
Okay, so we've got these horses, their chill factor is established, and now it's time to, like, turn up the heat a little.
Yeah.
How do they actually apply a pain stimulus in a way that's, controlled and measurable?
So they were using this pressure device, right, placed directly on the horse's leg. And remember, it was super precisely calibrated, so they knew exactly how much pressure was being applied to each horse. But here's where things get interesting. Even just the act of putting that device on before any pressure was applied, the quarter horses and the warm bloods, their PTA dipped.
Oh, wow. So they're already reacting even before anything really happens. Like they can sense something is up.
Yeah, like they're anticipating that something might be about to happen, which really speaks to that whole baseline difference we were talking about, right? Those horses, they might just be naturally more sensitive to changes in their environment. The Frisians, on the other hand, their PTA didn't even budge,
Uh-huh.
totally unfazed.
They're just like, whatever, this thing on my leg, no big deal. Okay, so we've got the device in place. Some of them are a little on edge and some are completely chill. What happens when they actually start applying the pressure?
So they increase the pressure gradually, very carefully, watching for what's called an aversive response. Basically, that's the point where the horse clearly tries to move away from the pressure, like a flinch, taking a step back, anything that tells you, okay, that horse is uncomfortable.
And all the while, they're monitoring the PTA, seeing what's happening under the hood, along with those external reactions.
You got it. They're looking at the PTA right before the pressure, at the moment the horse gives that aversive response, and then again 5 and 10 minutes later.
Okay, drum roll, please. Did the Frisians live up to their stoic reputation?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how the Frisians had that slightly higher baseline PTA? Well, during that pre-stimulus period, that difference became even more pronounced.
So even before they felt any actual pain, the Frisians were just internally calmer than the other breeds, while the quarter horses and warm bloods were internally freaking out a little just from the anticipation.
Exactly. And here's the kicker, the Frisians. They needed significantly more pressure on that device before they showed that aversive response. Significantly more than both the quarter horses and the warm bloods.
Wow. Okay, so that whole stoic Frisian thing, it's looking like there might actually be some science to back it up.
It's definitely suggesting that. But it goes beyond just, how much pressure they could tolerate. It's about how they reacted internally. Their PTA stayed really stable right up until they hit their pain threshold. It's like that internal calmness, it acted as a buffer against that escalating pressure.
That's so wild. And meanwhile, the quarter horses and warm bloods, their internal chill factor is plummeting, even before they outwardly react.
Right. They're showing these significant dips in their PTA, especially the quarter horses, even before the pressure is enough to cause a physical reaction. So, it's like they're experiencing a much more intense stress response, both physically and, well, emotionally, you could say.
Okay, so we've got the internal stuff going on, but what about externally? What were they seeing with the grimace scale? Were there any noticeable differences between the breeds in their facial expressions?
So all of the horses, every single one, they did show higher grimace scores when that pressure was applied, which tells us, they were all experiencing discomfort, no escaping that. But the interesting part is that their grimace scores, they actually correlated with those PTA changes.
So the more stressed out they were getting internally, the more their faces were showing it.
Exactly. It wasn't just a surface level thing. There were really clear, measurable changes happening on the inside, and those changes lined up with how much pain they were showing on the outside.
So we've talked about these internal changes, the external expressions of pain. But what about heart rate? Like, did their heart rate shoot up when the pressure was applied?
That's interesting, actually. Heart rate, it wasn't quite as clear-cut an indicator as the PTA and the grimace scale were in this study.
Really?
Yeah, they all did show a little bit of an increase in heart rate right when they showed that aversive response. But the difference between the breeds, it wasn't as big or as consistent as those other things we've been talking about.
So while heart rate's important, just relying on that might not give you the full picture when you're trying to assess pain in a horse, at least in this context.
Yeah, that seems to be the case here. It makes you think, right? Like maybe we need to look beyond just one single thing to really understand what's going on with these horses.
Makes you wonder, too, like, are we missing some subtle signs of pain in those horses who aren't as expressive? Are we underestimating their discomfort? Because some breeds are just, like, hardwired to be stoic.
That's a big question, and it's a super important one for vets and anyone working with horses to think about. This study, it just really emphasizes how complex pain perception is in these animals and how, breed differences might be a really significant factor in how they show or maybe don't show that pain.
It really drives home the point that we can't just look at what's on the surface. We have to connect the dots between what we're seeing in their behavior and what's happening internally.
Exactly. When we start considering both of those things, the physical and the behavioral, that's how we start to really understand pain in horses, especially those broods that are known for being a bit tough to read.
So as we wrap up here, were there any limitations with this research that we need to keep in mind?
Yeah, the researchers themselves acknowledge that doing more research with even more horses, different breeds, would be important to really confirm these findings. And it's important to remember that this study was looking at a very specific type of pain, mechanical pressure, right, on the leg. Other types of pain, like from colic or a wound, those might lead to different responses.
That's a good point. Pain is complex, and this study is really just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Exactly. But even with that in mind, it still gives us some really valuable insights into how differently horses might experience pain depending on their breed. It challenges us to rethink how we assess pain in all horses, especially those breeds known for keeping a stiff upper lip.
It's a great reminder that we can always learn more about these incredible animals,
Yeah.
and that the more we understand, the better we can care for them. Well, that was a fascinating deep dive. Any final thoughts for our listeners out there? Something to mull over as they head back to their practices?
Here's something to think about. As you're working with your patients, what are some of the subtle signs of stress or discomfort you've noticed in different breeds? Have you noticed any breed-specific tendencies in your own practice?
Such a great question. Keep those observational skills sharp and keep asking those questions. From vet neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.